They said I threw my future away for a girl, that I sacrificed everything for a fleeting romance. But what they didn't know was that I gave it up on purpose, and when it mattered most, I took it all back. David was the kind of student that made teachers believe in destiny. They said he was born with a mind designed for numbers, patterns, and perfection. At 16, he solved national-level physics problems like bedtime puzzles. At 17, his mock exam scores consistently hovered at the top of the province. For most, it was talent. For David, it was survival. He wasn't from a good family. His father disappeared in the night with loan sharks on his heels. His mother once stood on the rooftop with him in her arms, threatening to jump, just to break free from the man she'd once loved. David never forgot the look in her eyes, not fear, not despair, but exhaustion. He promised himself then he would get into the best university, escape this town, and never come back. And then came Mary. The first time he saw her, she was leaning against the library window in a navy skirt, her fingers twirling a strand of hair while her lips curled around a smile made for ruin. She wasn't just beautiful, she was crafted for temptation. And like every boy with hormones and a heartbeat, David fell hard. She approached him with that same syrupy voice she used on every teacher, tilting her head, pouting slightly. "Hey, you're good at math, right? Can you help me sometime?" He said yes. Of course he said yes. What 17-year-old could say no to a goddess pretending to need him? At first, it was innocent, study sessions in quiet corners, her perfume lingering on his hoodie, her hand brushing his under the table. Then came the teasing, the late-night messages, the karaoke dares, and finally, the kiss. That night, under flickering blue neon, she pulled him close and whispered, "Can't you be a bad student? Just for me?" He laughed. A real one. He was already halfway there. His grades had begun to dip. He'd skipped his last physics prep. He hadn't touched his mock paper in days. The next day, his name was missing from the top rankings. George made sure the whole school noticed. George, who used to trail just behind David in every subject. George, whose father happened to be the principal. George, who used to call David brother until Mary leaned into David's arms one too many times. But David didn't fight back. He smiled. Even when someone whispered in class, "He's ruined now, all for some girl," he just tapped his pen calmly against his textbook and nodded along. Because what they didn't see, what no one saw, was that David was watching everything. The glances George threw toward Mary when he thought no one was looking. The way Mary always, accidentally, wore the same perfume David once complimented. The conversations that cut off the second David entered a room. It didn't take a genius to figure out the game being played, but unfortunately for them, it did take a genius to win it. So David kept playing the fool. He held Mary tighter, let George believe he was winning, let the teachers shake their heads in disappointment. He let the whole world believe he had fallen. He only needed them to believe it, until the final results were announced, until the cameras were rolling, until every viewer watching the livestream had already buried him in pity. And then, just like that, he'd rise. David wasn't like the others. When the other kids were learning multiplication tables, he was breezing through algebra. When they were stumbling over grammar drills, he had already memorized the textbook front to back. He didn't need to study for hours. One read was enough. Formulas lived in his bones, concepts bloomed in his mind before the teacher could finish the sentence. It was a gift, one he didn't ask for, one he had to wield like a weapon just to survive. His home was a war zone. His father was a gambler who left behind nothing but unpaid debts and bloodied fists. His mother, brilliant once, broken now, had cracked under the weight of a life she couldn't fix. One night, when the collectors came pounding at the door again, she dragged David to the rooftop of their building. She wasn't crying, just tired. "If I let you go, maybe I'll finally be free," she whispered, her hands trembling around his wrist. That night, she didn't jump, but David never forgot the wind or the silence that followed. From that moment, he knew he was on his own. No miracles, no safety nets, just one way out, get into the best university in the country and never look back. For years, he kept his head down, first place, every time. Teachers praised him, students feared him. He didn't care about either. Every test was a stepping stone, every textbook, a weapon. He didn't have the luxury of friends or dreams. He had one goal, and nothing else mattered. Until Mary walked into the room, she transferred in the middle of the semester. Long hair, pale skin, lips stained in the faintest shade of cherry red. When she introduced herself, boys held their breath and girls held their boyfriends tighter. She was beautiful in a way that made people forget their names. David didn't even glance at her, at first, but Mary had a way of making herself unavoidable. She sat next to him in class. "I heard you're the smartest one here," she said, her voice soft and sweet. "Can I borrow your notes?" He handed them over without a word. The next day, she returned them with a smile. "You have really neat handwriting," she added, leaning in a little too close. He told himself it meant nothing, that he was just being polite, that the flutter in his chest would pass, but it didn't. She started asking for help after school, one-on-one sessions in the library, then the cafe, then the park. Every time, she'd laugh a little more, lean a little closer, brush his hand by accident, and every time, David let her. When she kissed him outside the study hall, he didn't even pretend to resist. It was his first kiss, and for a moment, just a moment, he let himself believe it was real. But it wasn't. Mary wasn't interested in equations or David's notes. She was interested in his weakness, and someone else had pointed it out to her. George. George, the golden boy, the principal's son. Always second best to David in academics, but first in charm, looks, and everything else that mattered in their shallow little town. He and Mary had dated before, everyone knew it, and everyone knew it hadn't ended cleanly. One day, they were the couple everyone envied. The next, they avoided each other like strangers. Or so it seemed. What David didn't know then, but would later uncover piece by piece, was that George hadn't let her go. He'd given her a task. "Get close to him," George had said, "make him fall, then break him." And Mary, she agreed, she said yes. Whether it was out of spite, boredom, or just a twisted idea of fun, she agreed. So she seduced David, she wrapped herself around him. She whispered, "Don't study today, stay with me." And he did. She pouted, "I feel like there's distance between us." So he stopped doing homework. She smiled, "Can't you be bad, just for me?" So he let himself slide. His scores began to drop. The teachers stopped calling on him. His name slowly slipped down the rankings until it wasn't even on the list. And through it all, Mary stayed close, kissed his neck, held his hand, whispered sweet nonsense in the dark. She thought she was winning, so did George. They didn't know the truth. David had overheard them once, in the storage room behind the gym, whispering when they thought no one else was around. "He's basically ruined," George laughed. "From top scorer to dropout, I almost feel bad." "Don't," Mary replied, adjusting her skirt in the reflection of a trophy case. "He's a simp, he'll follow me anywhere, even to a garbage school." David heard every word. He stood outside the door, notebook in hand, face unreadable. That night, he stayed up until dawn, solving problems, reading strategies, reviewing everything he'd ignored for the last 6 months. And then, he smiled. Because the game had finally begun. From that day on, David became the perfect puppet. He acted more desperate, more lost, more obsessed with Mary than ever before. He started failing even harder. Teachers sighed in disappointment, students whispered, George smirked, and Mary, she got comfortable, too comfortable. She didn't notice that he'd started disappearing again after school, back to the library, that the messy notes he scribbled in front of her were just for show. That every time she pulled him away from a study session, he was secretly testing her boundaries, calculating just how far he'd go to keep him distracted. He played the fool flawlessly, because that's what they needed him to be, and the more they believed it, the deeper the hole they dug for themselves. By the time the national exam approached, David had what he needed: proof, motivation, and most importantly, control. He let Mary buy the hotel room. He let George organize the livestream to humiliate him on results day. He even let them believe he was applying to a third-rate junior college, just to sweeten the final act. Because David wasn't a boy in love. He was a strategist sharpening his sword. And the day of reckoning was coming. At first, David truly believed it was real. Mary would tilt her head and tuck her hair behind her ear, and he'd feel something shift inside him, something reckless and warm. She smelled like lavender and late-night whispers. The way she whispered his name, soft, almost guilty, made him want to forget everything else. She was brilliant at pretending. They sat together in karaoke rooms lit with dim, flickering blues. She'd lean against his shoulder and steal glances while her fingers played with the hem of her skirt. "You always look so serious," she teased once, passing him the mic. "Can't you just relax, for me?" He tried. He stopped studying after school, skipped mock test reviews, watched as his name, once fixed at the top of every academic board, slowly slid downward week by week. Mary would notice the changes, the way his teachers stopped praising him. She'd smile and whisper, "Is it bad that I like this version of you more?" And David, God help him, smiled back. The truth is, she was addictive, her lips, her voice, the way she looked at him like he was the only one in the room. When she kissed him in the stairwell after finals, he thought it was love. When she pulled him into her room that night and wrapped herself around him like a fever, he thought it meant everything, but he was wrong, because the whole time, someone else was watching, George. George didn't have to lift a finger, he just waited while Mary pulled the strings. Every time David chose her over a textbook, every time he slept through class or skipped a study session, George saw it. The smirk on his face grew wider with every mistake. His plan was working, and the best part was, David had no idea, except, he did. The recording came to him by accident, or maybe it was fate. He had stayed back in the school archive room to retrieve an old textbook. That's when he heard it, laughter muffled through the thin partition wall. Familiar voices. "George's first. He's finished, got him completely wrapped around your finger." Then Mary's, softer but clearer. "He's so easy. All I have to do is kiss him once and he forgets what a textbook even looks like." David froze. "Think he'll get into college at all?" George asked. Mary laughed. "With those scores? He'll be lucky to get into a trade school. Honestly, I thought he'd put up more of a fight." David didn't move, didn't breathe, his fingers curled around the edge of the shelf until his knuckles turned white. "And if he finds out?" someone else asked. George shrugged. "Who cares? The idiot gave up everything. For what? A couple of kisses?" David stayed there long after their voices faded. His chest was hollow, but his mind was sharper than ever. He didn't storm out, didn't confront her, didn't scream or cry or ask her why. He just smiled. The next morning, when Mary came up behind him in class and wrapped her arms around his shoulders, he leaned back into her touch and said, "Missed you." She smiled, oblivious. He kept pretending. That day in the study hall, she wore the exact same perfume he once said he liked. When she leaned in to whisper in his ear, her lips brushed against his skin. "I want you to come over tonight," she said. "We'll celebrate. I think I finally passed chemistry." He nodded. "I'll bring snacks." She giggled and kissed his cheek. And David watched her walk away with a calm so perfect it almost scared him. Every word they'd said behind that wall, every cruel laugh, every lie, had scorched itself into his brain, but he kept playing along because now he understood the rules. They thought he was a broken boy in love. They didn't know he was an executioner with a clock in his hand. He let himself fall deeper, stayed over at her place more often, ignored his tutors, deleted prep reminders from his phone. And every time she touched him, kissed him, held him, he let her. Let her believe she was in control. Mary didn't notice the difference. She was used to being worshipped. She thought David was just another pathetic admirer. But there were signs. Like the fact that he'd started disappearing at night, claiming he was too tired to hang out, when really, he was locking himself in the library until dawn. Or how he suddenly stopped asking her for help, even in classes where he used to struggle. Or how, during one particularly strange afternoon, he pulled away from her kiss and said, "You should be careful, Mary. People who lie too often eventually forget what the truth looks like." She blinked. "What's that supposed to mean?" He only smiled. That was the first time her expression faltered, but she recovered quickly, laughing it off, brushing it away like lint off a dress. David was just being weird, she told herself. He was still hers, still falling. Only he wasn't. George continued smirking in the hallways, tossed him mocking glances, made snide comments in front of their classmates. "Guess some people can't handle pressure," he said once. Loud enough for everyone to hear. "But hey, love makes people do crazy things, right?" David just chuckled. "You'd know." George's jaw clenched. For just a second. Mary tried to keep them apart, out of some flicker of guilt, or fear, or maybe just because George was getting impatient. She started to pull David in closer, tighter, like she was trying to cement her control over him. She even said, "Let's apply to the same college, somewhere simple, together." He kissed her and said, "Sure." She didn't see the way his eyes didn't match the smile. George did. That week, he cornered David in the locker room after class, the usual smugness gone, replaced by something sharper. "You're getting cocky," he said. David shrugged. "I'm just in love." George stepped closer. "You really think she's yours?" David looked up slowly. "She isn't?" George smirked. "You've got no idea what she tells me when you're not around." David didn't respond, just turned back to his locker and zipped his bag. But his voice, when he finally spoke, was ice. "She'll leave when you tell her to, right?" George raised an eyebrow. "Because she's not really yours either," David said softly. "She's just the only tool you had left." For the first time, George didn't have a comeback. He watched as David walked out, slow, unbothered, the perfect image of a boy still pretending to be broken. Mary was waiting outside, smiling. David leaned down, kissed her temple, and whispered, "I've never loved anyone like I love you." She melted. He looked over her shoulder and met George's eyes one last time, then he winked. David lay awake in the dark, the hum of the ceiling fan slicing the silence like a dull blade. Mary was asleep beside him, one hand draped over his chest in the same way she always did when she was trying to stake a claim. Her face in sleep was soft, innocent even, eyes closed, lips parted, the faint rise and fall of her breathing pressing against his ribs. It was a face he'd once memorized with the same precision he used to memorize formulas. A face he'd once wanted more than escape, more than ambition, more than anything. But not anymore. He stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of her arm like a shackle. One part of him still wanted to believe it, wanted to believe that somewhere between the hotel keys and the whispered confessions, she'd really fallen for him. That her tears weren't just another move on a chessboard. That when she clung to him after exams, trembling and whispering his name, it was real. But the other part of him, the scarred part, knew better. His fingers slid down his chest until they found the raised ridges carved into his skin. The old burn marks from George's cigarette, the jagged letters etched with a compass point. Dog. The first time George carved it, he'd said, "You're beneath me, you'll crawl for the rest of your life." David had bitten his lip so hard he'd tasted blood, refusing to scream. He'd memorized every line of pain as if he could store it away and one day spend it back with interest. And then there was the dog. The night George tied him to the fence behind the sports field was freezing. His uniform shirt was already shredded from previous beatings. He still remembered the gleam in George's eyes as he snapped his fingers and the animal lunged. Teeth sank into his waist, tearing flesh away. George watched calmly, like a man enjoying a show. He even laughed when David's knees buckled. Somewhere nearby, Mary's voice drifted, light, careless laughter, the sound of her kissing George behind the gym as David bled into the dirt. David closed his eyes. He could still smell the iron tang of his own blood mixed with damp earth. He could still hear George's voice. "This is where you belong." His hand clenched tighter around the small black SD card in his palm. The edge of it cut into his skin, a sharp reminder that he wasn't dreaming. It held everything. The dashcam footage of the alley, the audio recordings from behind the archive wall. Proof, not just of the beatings, but of the setup. Proof that he'd been patient, that he'd never lost control, that every slip, every failure, every mistake had been an act. He rolled onto his side, looking at Mary, her hair spilled across the pillow like gold threads. Even now, she was breathtaking. Her perfume, his favorite, still clung to her. It was almost enough to make him doubt himself. Almost. Her eyes fluttered open. "You're awake," she murmured, voice heavy with sleep. "Yeah," he said softly. She reached for him, trailing her fingers down his arm. "You're thinking again." "Always," he whispered. She smiled faintly, unaware. "Come back to bed, we'll sleep in tomorrow. You can skip class again." He almost laughed. Even now, she was still trying to pull him off track, still trying to tighten the leash she didn't realize he'd already slipped. "Sure," he said, "we'll sleep in." She smiled and drifted back to sleep, her hand slipping from his arm. David sat up, sliding out from under the blanket with practiced ease. He stood in the dim light of the window, shirtless, scars illuminated by the pale glow of the street lamp. For a long time he just looked at himself. The boy in the glass had the same sharp eyes, the same jawline. But something in his expression had changed. He whispered to his reflection, "Almost time." His thumb brushed over the SD card again. It felt heavier than it should, like a blade disguised as a pebble. He thought of George's smirk during lunch, of the way Mary had kissed his cheek afterwards, eyes flicking toward George as if to check whether she'd done her job. He thought of the whispers in the hallway. "David's done for. He used to be so smart. Now he's just a simp." He remembered them all. He stored every insult, every laugh, every glance. Mary shifted in her sleep and murmured his name. For a heartbeat, his chest tightened. A flicker of the old ache stirred, the part of him that had wanted her from the moment she first smiled at him over her notebook. He wondered, briefly, if she even understood the difference between playing and feeling, if she'd been so deep in George's plan that she'd lost track of herself. But then he remembered the dog, the compass, the fence. He remembered her lipstick on George's collar, and the flicker died. When dawn broke, David was already back at his desk. The room was silent except for the scratch of his pen. Old habits came back like second nature, equations fell into place, strategies formed. He moved through the material like a man sharpening knives. Mary padded out of the bedroom, wearing his shirt like a dress. "You're up early," she said, rubbing her eyes. He glanced at her, expression neutral. "Couldn't sleep." "You're going to burn out if you keep doing this," she said, coming closer. "Come back to bed. Please?" He smiled faintly. "I won't burn out." She tilted her head, searching his face. "You've been different lately." "Have I?" "Yes," she said, a faint crease forming between her brows. "You look at me like you're not really here." He closed his notebook slowly and stood, moving toward her until they were inches apart. "Maybe I'm not," he murmured. Her breath caught. But he only kissed her forehead and stepped past her, grabbing his bag. "Don't wait up," he said. She stood there, staring at his back as he left. For the first time, she looked unsure. Outside, the morning air was cool against his face. He slid the SD card into his inner pocket and adjusted his bag strap. His phone buzzed with a new message from a prep school tutor confirming an appointment. He had exactly 2 weeks until the national exam. 2 weeks until the curtain rose. He walked to the library, his pace steady, his mind clear. Behind him, somewhere he couldn't see, Mary watched from the window. Her hand pressed against the glass, her lips parted as if she wanted to call out to him but couldn't. David didn't look back. In his pocket, the SD card felt like a heartbeat. Proof, leverage, revenge. Every step he took was a step out of her world, a step back into his own. But she didn't know that yet. And when the day came, when the cameras rolled and George smiled his victorious smile, she'd finally see the truth. Revenge was coming. The air in the computer lab was thick with anticipation. Rows of aging desktops buzzed under the weight of national exam traffic. Students hovered in front of their screens, their fingers twitching above the check results button. Outside, a banner read W Province High School livestream Gaokao viewing, first time in history. Lights were set, tripods pointed, microphones were clipped, the cameras were rolling. This was George's idea. Of course it was. He had suggested the live stream to his father, the principal, just a week earlier. "Let's show the world how far our school's come," he'd said, all bright-eyed and loyal. But David knew better. George didn't want to highlight the school's progress. He wanted to humiliate someone, love. And today, that someone was supposed to be David. George stood at the front, flanked by 2 teachers, wearing his best school blazer and that unmistakable smirk. "Let's not pretend this isn't a big deal," he said to the camera. "This year's scores will shape the rest of our lives." Laughter broke out politely among the staff behind him. Even Mary giggled beside David, her hand rested gently on his arm, possessive, casual. "You're not nervous, are you?" she whispered. David glanced at her, deadpan. "Not at all." She smiled. She still thought she held the reins, even now, even here. The lab lights flickered, dozens of monitors lit up with login portals. The first student gasped, I got 6 on 10. Another one screamed, 596, yes. Applause echoed faintly. The livestream chat lit up, filled with emojis and virtual thumbs up. Then George stepped forward. Let's make it interesting, he said, loud enough for the microphones to catch. Everyone knows I've been working hard for the last 2 years, but what most people don't know is, I used to be number 2. He turned toward the camera. Number 1 was a guy named David, he said, dragging the name out. Like venom. But, let's just say he got distracted. The chat exploded. Wait, what? Name dropping? Bold. Is that the smart kid turned simp rumor guy? David didn't blink. He leaned back in his chair and crossed one leg over the other. George gestured to him theatrically. And here he is. Let's see what happens when love beats logic. Mary shifted beside David. She squeezed his arm tighter, comforting, possessive. Her smile was smug. She genuinely thought this was her victory lap. David, George said, go ahead, show everyone how hard you worked. Cameras zoomed in, students turned, screens were projected onto the main monitor, all eyes landed on David. He moved slowly, deliberately, and clicked, check score. The screen went blank. A pause, confused murmurs rippled across the room, then the text appeared. Score shielded, candidate is among the top 50 in province, contact admissions office directly. Silence. It took the chat a full 2 seconds to react, then it detonated. Shielded? No way. Top 50? Wait, wasn't he supposed to fail? Mary's hand fell from his arm, her smile vanished. George leaned forward like the screen had betrayed him. David's phone buzzed. Capital University Admissions Office. Hello, David, congratulations on your exceptional Gaokao score. We'd like to meet with you at 2 p.m. today. He turned the screen toward Mary, her lips parted, her breath caught. George finally spoke, his voice cracking. That has to be a glitch. He rushed to the teacher's console, furiously typing. Check his score manually, it's impossible. No one moved. The principal stepped forward, pale. Is this? Another buzz. Another message. W. Province Gaokao Authority. Congratulations, your score of 726 places you as the top science track student in the province. David stood. Cameras followed. I guess all that love really paid off, he said. George stumbled backward, like he'd been struck. Mary stared at him, wide-eyed, lips trembling. The chat feed was out of control now. He's number 1? This is like an anime. The twist? I bet the girl's freaking out. David looked at Mary. Funny, isn't it? He said quietly. You all tried to ruin me. You played your part perfectly. She shook her head. David, I didn't know. I thought. He smiled, slow and cruel. I was never yours to break. He took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough that only she and George could hear. I let you hold the knife, Mary, but you never noticed it wasn't sharp. She flinched. He turned to George. You wanted to humiliate me on camera, he said. Now you'll be viral for something else. Then he leaned forward, eyes locked on George's crumbling face. You always wanted to beat me, but now the whole country knows, your girlfriend and your rank both belong to me. The room tilted. A teacher faintly said, cut the feed, cut the feed. But it was too late. Over 50,000 people had seen it live, and another 5 million would see the replay. George staggered out of the room. Mary just stood there, frozen in place. David looked into the nearest camera and gave a small, perfectly measured smile. Then he whispered, thanks for watching. Room 401 smelled faintly of melted wax and something sweet and floral, the same perfume Mary used to wear when she first sat next to David in class. Candles flickered on every surface, their flames trembling like frightened birds. She had dimmed the lights, drawn the curtains, and scattered rose petals across the bed in a scene lifted straight out of the romance dramas she once mocked. Her hands were clasped in front of her chest, fingers white at the knuckles. When David stepped through the door, she sprang toward him as if he were the last lifeboat on a sinking ship. Her hair tumbled forward, her face pale but still heartbreakingly beautiful. David, she whispered, voice cracking. I didn't mean it. I didn't mean any of it. She reached for his wrist. I love you now, I swear I do. Please. Let's start over. We can go anywhere you want. We'll leave this town behind. He closed the door behind him but didn't touch her. His face was calm, unreadable, the kind of calm that had once terrified invigilators who watched him finish an impossible paper with perfect composure. He took a single step forward, and she faltered, her arms still outstretched. "I've been waiting for you all day," she said, her voice breaking. "I kept thinking about what you've done for me, about how you stood by me even when—" She choked back a sob. "Even when I didn't deserve it. I was wrong, David. I see that now." He said nothing. He just began unbuttoning his shirt. She blinked. "David?" He pulled the fabric aside and let it slide from his shoulders. Under the candlelight, his torso came into view, burn marks seared into his skin like brands, ragged scars that had long since healed but never faded, and across his ribs, the word carved with a compass, dog. Each letter raised and angry, a permanent echo of someone else's cruelty. Mary's hands began to shake. "What?" she whispered. "What happened? To you?" Her eyes flicked over each wound like they were reading a story she'd never known existed. She reached out, but he caught her wrist before she could touch him. "You want to know why?" David said quietly, his voice low and steady. "Because George couldn't touch my mind, so he used you to break my body." Her lips trembled. "No," she said. "I didn't know about this. I didn't think he'd ever—" David raised his phone. He pressed play. The room filled with George's voice, raw and unfiltered. The audio he'd saved was ugly, George laughing between breaths, recounting the night he tied David to the fence, the dog snarling in the background, the sound of David gasping through clenched teeth. "He thinks he's better than me. I'll teach him where he belongs. I'll have my girl bring him down from the inside. When he's crawling, when he's nothing, I'll spit on him, and he'll thank me." Mary's face went white. She sank to her knees, the sound of George's voice wrapping around her like a noose. She covered her mouth with both hands, but the audio kept going, George bragging, mocking, naming her as part of the plan. "She's perfect for it," George said on the recording. "Pretty enough to distract him, cold enough to play along. He won't even see it coming." Mary's shoulders shook, tears slipped down her cheeks and dropped onto the floor, making tiny dark spots on the carpet. "Stop it," she whispered. "Please stop it." David did not stop the recording. She crawled closer to him on her knees, clutching at the hem of his trousers like a penitent at an altar. "I didn't know he would do that to you," she said, her voice high and panicked. I thought it was just a game, that you'd slack off, that we'd drift apart and that would be it. I didn't know about the rest." He looked down at her, his expression carved from stone. "You didn't need to know," he said. "You still did what you did." "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I regret everything. Please just say something. Tell me there's a way back." He crouched down slightly so their eyes were level. She saw no warmth in them now, only a cold light like the edge of a blade. "There isn't," he said. Her breath hitched. "David." He thumbed off the audio. The silence afterward felt heavier than the recording itself. The only sounds were her muffled sobs and the hiss of the candles. "I can't undo what George did to me," he said quietly, "but I can choose what I do with what you gave me." She reached for him again, trembling. "I love you now," she whispered. "I really do. I don't care about his plan anymore. I don't care about my future. I just want you." David straightened, sliding his shirt back over his shoulders without buttoning it. "You want me?" he asked softly. "You wanted the boy you could ruin. But that boy doesn't exist anymore." She shook her head, tears streaking her face. "No. That's not true." "It is," he said. "I used you as much as you used me." Her hands fell to her lap. "What?" He stepped back from her reach, his voice like a closing door. "Every test I failed, every night I spent with you instead of studying, every time I smiled while you whispered lies, all of it was for this moment." Mary's sob caught in her throat. "David!" He silenced her with a glance. "I was never yours to break," he said. "You were mine to use." For a moment, she just knelt there, staring up at him. Then the truth landed, and her body folded in on itself like paper. She pressed her forehead to the floor and cried, the sound raw and unguarded. David reached into his pocket and pulled out a plain white envelope. He dropped it onto the carpet between them. It landed soundlessly beside her trembling hands. She looked at it through blurred eyes. What is this? 50,000 yuan, he said. Everything I spent during our time together, hotels, trips, meals, all of it. She blinked up at him, stunned. I'm paying it back, he said. This isn't a gift, it's a refund. You can consider our contract ended. Her lips parted, but no words came out. He turned toward the door. Behind him, her sobs rose and fell like waves. David, she whispered, please, please don't leave me like this. He paused at the threshold. For a heartbeat, she thought he might turn back, but he didn't. He only said, you helped him carve the word dog into my body. I carved something else out of yours, time, youth, and now it's over. And then he left, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving her alone in the candlelit room with the audio still echoing faintly from his phone. The footage was submitted to the police anonymously, but David made sure it reached every platform that mattered. It began with George's voice, arrogant, unfiltered, laughing about how he carved the word dog into David's ribs. The recording then cut to grainy dashcam footage, a narrow alley, George and his friends cornering a smaller figure. The beating played out in cold, detached silence. And then came Mary's voice, heard clearly in the background, asking George if he was done breaking the nerd. The internet caught fire. In under 6 hours, the clip hit 10 million views. Hashtags exploded. Hashtag Gao Cow Revenge, hashtag Top Scorer Survives, hashtag They Tried to Break David. Mainstream media picked it up before the school even understood what had happened. Interviews, op-eds, reaction videos. One outlet titled it, The Boy They Tried to Ruin, and the Genius Who Rose Anyway. The police arrived at George's house the next morning. They didn't knock politely. David watched it all unfold from a quiet cafe booth across the street, sipping a black coffee, his expression unreadable. His laptop glowed with updates, order notifications pouring in from students and parents nationwide. The valedictorian study notes had gone viral too. He didn't plan for that part, he only uploaded them because he wanted something to do while the dust settled. But something about the story, the underdog who came back from the edge, the boy who turned scars into fuel, resonated. Tens of thousands of copies sold in a week. Review pages overflowed with comments. My son cried reading your speech. Your notes got my daughter into her dream school. You made my lazy nephew pick up a pencil. And so the money came, quietly, consistently. His account balance ticked upward, like clockwork. He never smiled at the numbers. Mary saw it all too, from the shadows, far behind the glow of his rising star. She watched him on screens, in news clips, in recommended videos she didn't even ask for. Always dressed in crisp whites or grays, always speaking calmly, precisely, always untouchable. She held the bank card he had left her, the one with exactly 50,000 yuan. It sat in her drawer like a splinter in her skin. Some nights she would open the drawer just to look at it. She never spent a cent. She remembered what he said when he handed it to her. That's what your betrayal cost me. I've paid it back. We're done. Not a gift, a refund, a receipt for the most expensive mistake of her life. David ignored her messages. He changed numbers. He moved out of his old address. The more famous he got, the smaller her chances of reaching him became. She even tried to attend one of his public lectures, but the crowd was too thick. She never got close. 1 month later, he was invited to give the opening speech at Capital University's incoming class ceremony. He arrived early, alone. Dressed in his cleanest black suit, a steel grey tie, and the quiet confidence of a man who had carved his path through hell. As he stood behind the podium, flashbulbs clicked, students leaned forward, parents held their breath. He looked out over the sea of new faces and began to speak. When I was your age, I had nothing, not family, not money, not protection. I only had my books, my grades, and a body full of bruises no one ever saw, but I climbed anyway. He paused. You'll hear that the world is fair, that talent rises on its own, but the truth is, sometimes, the world tries to break you first, tries to convince you you're nothing before you can prove otherwise. He looked straight into the camera. If you're stuck in the mud, cut away the thorns and build a raft. Stack your pain into steps. Don't beg for a rescue, be your own escape. The hall erupted. The livestream chat was chaos, goosebumps. He's the truth. My son is listening to this every day from now on. From dog to God. After the ceremony, reporters surrounded him. David, do you have a girlfriend? Any message for the people who doubted you? Did you ever forgive those who hurt you? He smiled politely, answering what he needed to. But then he saw someone lingering in the back, near the side exit. She was beautiful, shoulder-length hair, simple dress, notebook clutched to her chest. A senior girl. As he walked past, she pointed toward the crowd. That girl back there, your ex? David glanced without turning his head. Yeah. The girl raised an eyebrow. She's pretty. He nodded. Beautiful face, ugly soul. The senior girl laughed. So what kind of girl are you into now? David tucked his hands in his pockets and smiled. Still figuring that out. He stepped out into the sunlight, the crowd's noise fading behind him. The gates of Beijing University stood tall in front of him, an archway into the life he had earned drop by drop, scar by scar. The sun lit his face as he walked through them, and somewhere behind him, Mary watched one last time before disappearing into the crowd. I'm David, he said to no one, voice low and steady, and I was never a spare.